Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep into a topic that people don't always talk about openly. Women in kink.
It's true. There are a lot of misconceptions out there.
Right. We've got research, we've got firsthand stories, and we're going to unpack all of it.
I'm ready. It's fascinating how often we oversimplify women's experiences with pleasure and desire.
It's like those conversations stop before they even start, which is why we're doing this deep dive. We're looking at research, including some really insightful work by Jennifer Redhor and Julia Schiffman, where they actually talk to women about their experiences with kink. And one thing that becomes really clear is that it's so much more than what you see in movies or on TV.
Way more nuanced.
Yeah.
More diverse. And honestly, way more interesting than those often pretty stereotypical portrayals.
One of the first things that struck me going through this research is how many different reasons women have for exploring kink. It's not just about, wanting to try new things in the bedroom, although for some women it is about that. But we're also talking about women who find it empowering, women who are curious about pushing their own boundaries, or even women who are just exploring different parts of their identities.
It's about agency, right?
Yeah.
Feeling in control of your desires, your choices. That's powerful no matter how it plays out in a person's life.
Absolutely. But I think, before we go any further, we have to address something that I think trips people up when it comes to kink. It's not always about sex.
And that's huge. We need to broaden how we define both kink and sexual activity. I mean, even just looking at the dictionary, the Cambridge Dictionary, for example, it defines sexual activity as physical activity between people involving sexual organs, and get this, I'm quoting here, for the production of babies.
Wow. Okay, first of all, that definition is a lot. But also, doesn't that just completely ignore, the entire spectrum of acts and experiences people find erotic and pleasurable?
Right. It's incredibly limiting. And honestly, it feels really clinical for something that's supposed to be about, personal feelings and experiences.
Totally.
The research we're looking at suggests a much broader definition of sexual activity, where it's any activity that creates feelings of eroticism, which makes way more sense. It puts the power back in the hands of the individual.
So much better. Okay, so with this broader understanding of what sexual activity can be, how does that then connect with kink? Because one of the things that I found so fascinating is that women experience this in really different ways.
You're right. There's no one-size-fits-all here. For some women, kink is totally connected to sex. It's about enhancing pleasure, making things more intense, and finding deeper fulfillment in their sex lives. So they might incorporate BDSM, role-playing, or other kink practices into their sexual experiences, and it becomes a core part of what makes that experience satisfying.
And there are some great analogies in the research that illustrate this. One woman described sex without kink as, and I quote, oatmeal without brown sugar.
Ooh, I like that one.
Right. Another one compared it to plain tofu.
Okay, so maybe not the most appetizing analogies, but I get the point.
Exactly. For those women, it's not just about the act itself. It's about the flavor, the excitement, the depth that those practices bring.
See, add extra something.
But then you've got this whole other group of women who experience kink completely separate from their sex lives.
Which I'll admit, even for me, took a minute to wrap my head around.
It really challenges those preconceived notions.
Right?
Right? But it's a real thing. In the research, we see women who are celibate, women who haven't had intercourse, but they're out there, active participants in the kink community.
And they're finding fulfillment, connection, maybe even pleasure through these practices in ways that have nothing to do with sex.
There's this one quote that really stuck with me. I don't have sex with my BDSM play partners. It's so direct. But it makes it so clear that those two things don't have to go hand in hand.
And their reasons for keeping those experiences separate are just as diverse, right? Some prefer it that way. It fulfills different needs or desires. For others, it might be about personal boundaries, exploring their sexuality, but not in a sexual way, or maybe even just finding community. It really makes you think about how limiting those assumptions can be when we just automatically assume kink equals sex.
Yeah. It's like we're discovering a whole new world or something.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to another term that I think we should talk about, vanilla.
Oh, yeah. How could we forget?
It's often used to describe sex that's seen as, conventional or maybe lacking the intensity you might find in kink.
But even vanilla is subjective, though, right? What one person finds boring, someone else might love.
You're totally right. The research actually talks about this, how those ideas about what's vanilla are shaped by our culture, our personal experiences, even just our individual preferences. There's no universal definition.
It's like saying everyone likes the same ice cream flavor. It's just not true.
Exactly. And it reminds us to be thoughtful about the language we use and not jump to conclusions about what someone else finds pleasurable or fulfilling.
For sure. So speaking of fulfilling, let's talk about those non-sexual reasons why someone might be interested in kink. Because I think this is where things get really interesting,
Absolutely. The research, especially the work by Rahor and Schiffman, shows how kink can be this powerful tool for personal growth and self-discovery.
which goes back to what we were saying before about agency, right? It's about feeling empowered to explore who you are, push your own boundaries, even if it means going against what society expects.
It's like giving yourself permission to define what feels right for you.
And sometimes that means getting a little uncomfortable, pushing past those comfort zones.
And that can be incredibly empowering in itself.
There's this quote from this study that I keep coming back to. I like knowing that I can handle more than I think I can. And I think that applies to so much more than just physical limits.
You're right. It's about building confidence in yourself, your ability to handle tough situations, set boundaries, advocate for what you need and want. Those are skills that can help you in all aspects of life.
It's like kink, in a way, can be a way to empower yourself.
Absolutely. And for a lot of women, it's also about building really deep trust and emotional connection. And that's especially true in BDSM.
That might surprise some people, I think. When you hear BDSM, you don't always picture, warm and fuzzy feelings.
Yeah, it's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind.
So how does that work then? What's the connection?
It comes down to communication, vulnerability, and of course, consent. When it's done ethically and safely, BDSM requires a ton of trust and open communication between partners.
You're really putting yourself out there, both physically and emotionally.
Exactly. You're talking about your boundaries, your desires, what you're okay with, what you're not okay with. And yeah, sometimes you're literally putting your safety in someone else's hands. That requires a really deep level of trust.
And in a way, isn't that act of trusting someone so completely, so vulnerably, what creates that strong bond?
Absolutely. It's about building intimacy through that shared vulnerability. And that intimacy can be really powerful, whether it's expressed sexually or not.
So it's like this interesting paradox where kink, something that often gets labeled as just physical or even taboo, can actually be this path to a deeper emotional connection and personal growth.
It really makes you question those stereotypes, doesn't it? And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from all of this research. It's not about fitting into some predefined box. It's about defining your own terms and finding what feels right for you.
It really makes you think about how we approach these topics, right? Because for something that's often seen as, I don't know, secretive or taboo, there's actually a surprising amount of vulnerability and communication involved in kink, especially when you consider the emotional and psychological aspects.
It's true, and I think that's something we often forget to talk about. Kink can push you to be really honest with yourself and aware of yourself in a way that's not always easy, but it can be incredibly rewarding.
You're kind of forced to confront those things head on, right? Your desires, your boundaries, even your fears,
Yeah,
things you might not want to think about otherwise.
absolutely. It's about figuring out what you're into, what you're not into, and what you're willing to explore. And yeah, that can be a little scary, but it's also incredibly freeing.
It's like you're taking control.
Exactly. You're owning your pleasure, your boundaries.
And of course, finding partners who respect those boundaries. Which brings us to something we can't really shy away from when talking about kink, the whole pain thing. It's kind of the elephant in the room, isn't it?
It's definitely something that comes up a lot, and understandably so, given how kink is often portrayed. But I think it's important to remember that the experience of pain is incredibly subjective. What one person finds pleasurable, another person might find completely unbearable.
Which is where those terms sadism and masochism come in, right?
Exactly. Sadism is generally about finding pleasure in inflicting pain or watching someone else experience it. And then masochism is the opposite, finding pleasure in receiving pain. But even within those definitions, there's a huge range of experiences and preferences.
It's not just as simple as pain or no pain.
Right, it's way more complex than that. It's about understanding that pain and pleasure can be connected in really complicated ways, and those connections are deeply personal. And again, it always comes back to consent, clear communication, and negotiated boundaries. Without those things, it's not kink, it's abuse.
So important.
Yeah.
And something we should probably say again and again. Consent is non-negotiable. End of story.
Absolutely. And as we're talking about all of this, I think it's important to reiterate that women's experiences with kink are so individual. There's no single narrative that captures the full picture.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating. It challenges us to really listen to each other, be open-minded, and remember that everyone's experience is valid.
I couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into women in kink, What's one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no right or wrong way to experience desire, pleasure, or kink. It's about agency. It's about having the freedom to define what those things mean to you and to seek out what feels good on your own terms.
Love that. And listener, wherever you fall on the spectrum of curiosity when it comes to kink, I hope this conversation has encouraged you to approach these topics with an open mind, a lot of compassion, and always, always prioritize respect and consent. Until next time, keep those conversations going, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.